When disaster and unfair treatment present themselves, we are reminded of the resilience and strength of our diverse Nikkei community.
Social activism. In its current usage, the term did not exist in the 1930s, but it would certainly fit a group of young Nisei who came up with a plan to lift the cloud of the Great Depression. They urged the Issei merchants of Little Tokyo to be more inclusive in their hiring of and marketing to their fellow Nisei. In an America of overt racism, which limited where they could live, work, and conduct business, these young activists sought to not only assume their rightful place in their own community, at the time ruled by Issei men, but also to establish a foothold in mainstream America. This is evident in Chairman John Maeno's message for the first Nisei Week in 1934. The Nisei is a new American, racially of the Orient. He is a true and loyal citizen of the United States, his native land. Young, ambitious, hopeful, though at times oppressed, he seeks to take his place in the civic development and community progress.
Today we are celebrating the Nisei Week tradition in an unprecedented manner. Like many others, we are celebrating virtually. We hold this virtual celebration during a key moment in our history. The COVID-19 pandemic has required us to live our lives in unforeseeable ways. Beyond the pandemic, we're also living in a time that is important in the history of our nation. Recent polls have estimated that up to 25 million Americans have participated in demonstrations over the death of George Floyd.
Seeing the civil rights movement unfold in the 1960s, and I saw dogs being sicked on these nonviolent protesters, demonstrators, African Americans. I saw police shoot water cannons, blowing these people across the streets. It's not unlike the scene that you're seeing today unfold on television in the aftermath of the George Floyd murder. And yet it affected me greatly because I was taught about the Constitution, about the right to protest, about the right to equality. And it confused me to see these people, these African Americans, having to fight and demonstrate to gain the very rights that were guaranteed under the Constitution. Why was that so? It didn't make sense to me. And what didn't make sense to me later was when I learned much more about the incarceration of my parents, my whole family, my then one-year-old brother who was deemed a threat to this country. And we found out much later, of course, that the justification of military necessity was totally manufactured. It was a fraudulent justification or argument for putting 120,000 people in prisons for indefinite confinement in the most dismal places in this country, without trial, without hearing, notice of charges, or an attorney, even though 2/3 of them were American citizens, for indefinite confinement, which we learned later in some of the cases that we brought many years later. The justification was absolutely false, and the government knew they were lies, since no Japanese American had ever been arrested, or much less convicted, for espionage or sabotage.
We must realize the importance of our community standing up and being counted at this time. The history of Nisei Week reflects how our community has responded to momentous events in society. During the 1960s, there were calls for civil rights. During the 1970s, there were protests against the war in Vietnam and also the forced eviction of many residents within Little Tokyo due to redevelopment. During the 1980s, there was a call for redress for Japanese Americans incarcerated during World War II. In subsequent decades, there have been calls for the preservation and development of Little Tokyo as a historic center for Japanese Americans. Nisei Week has always been at the center of our community spirit regarding these issues.
Certainly, the incarceration and concentration camps during World War II played a huge role in shaping our collective cultural identity. I believe it has made us more deeply appreciative of the principles of fairness, equality, justice, and given us, I think, a sense of responsibility, the need to stand up and say something when we see others in society being mistreated or denied rights as we were.
I've thought about this, and I do not have a definition for social justice, but I was born in a camp, Tule Lake, and as an example of governmental lack of leadership.
For me, social justice is having equal economic and political and social rights and opportunity as everybody else. There shouldn't be a disparity among who gets what, or how easy life is, or what they can get with what they have growing up, or what color their skin is, or their sexual orientation, or their religion, or anything like that. In the beginning, it was really tough. To be honest, I cried a lot. It was just so heartbreaking to see it. You know, my George Floyd was my mom's Rodney King. You know, like it's still going on, and it's so sad, and I didn't know how to react. Like, I was so angry and so sad at the same time. It can just start with your family. It can start with your friends. A lot of people aren't educated, so I think a lot of people need to start from there, educate themselves, research themselves, learn about the topic, about what's going on, rather than just talking about it and thinking that you're always right, you know?
So one of the easiest ways to become more involved in social justice is to get educated. Talk to somebody new, listen to a podcast, read a new article, learn what challenges people are facing in different communities, to then in turn become a better ally and supporter of them. Before you act, listen, read, learn, to make sure that you're making the right action in a respectful and empathetic way. I found that one of the best ways to speak up for social justice is to find groups that are already doing the work and then offer your perspective. When I joined Okaidi back in 2019, I was able to bring my viewpoint, my experiences to the table and help them amplify their own voices. I think finding people who are doing the work that you believe in and then supporting them wholeheartedly is one of the best ways to build your own capacity to make positive social change.
So for me, social justice in big part means fighting for a world where all of us have access to resources, whether it's social, economic, political, just access to resources that allow us to make the best decisions for ourselves and our lives, and to be able to do that in a community that really celebrates and uplifts all of our complexities and interconnectedness.
Social justice is about people movements. I love a good people movement, but it's advocating for people to make sure that their voices are heard, especially when it has to do with social injustice, recognizing that things aren't equitable and not everyone's given the same opportunities due to race, gender, sexuality, disabilities or capabilities, and that we need to acknowledge these things, even if it's an uncomfortable learning experience, to recognize how we're different and how we're treated differently and how it's not fair, and to advocate for more fair practices, and to make people more aware of how things are unfair, to kind of correct what we can, and continue to strive for that is what social justice means to me.
It's important during this time for us to not just completely react to everything that we're seeing, but to also observe and be thoughtful and gather our observations during this time so that we can take thoughtful action when the time is right.
It's very important to speak up when you see something unjust, because if we do not, who will? And when we need help, who will stand up for us? And that happened to the Japanese American people.
Fundamentally, it should really never be about speaking for someone else, but just using your power and privilege to be able to redistribute the power that exists in that space. And I think that talking about social justice isn't something that you can just compartmentalize to a specific space in your life. And I also just want to say that it doesn't have to be a heavy conversation either. what that looks like for me is to always be intentional about lifting up the communities that have brought me to this point, which are mainly the Black and Latinx queer and trans communities, the sex worker community, the POC writing community, the reproductive justice movement. All of those spaces have brought me to this point. And by bringing those folks into the room, I really hope to be able to offer an increasingly expansive understanding of what it means to be a queer Japanese person who's an accomplice, to be an integral part of this movement that's really fighting for the liberation of all of us.
With Nisei Week again firmly established, interrupted only by a world war, and now a global pandemic, it is interesting to note the current mission statement still reflects the original message of inclusiveness: to promote Japanese American heritage and traditions while bringing together the diverse communities of Southern California through arts and cultural education. With continued inclusion, education, and vigilance, I look forward to the day when Japanese Americans and all minorities will be known and treated simply as Americans.
And this is where your allies come in. This is where your notion of community should be enlarged. And enlarged to mean it's not just Japanese Americans, it is people of all colors who can come in and be allies to help out. People who have sensibilities and respect for Asian Pacific Americans, for Japanese Americans, people who, and there are Caucasians I know who speak way better Japanese than I do, and who are culturally more Japanese than I am. And to not discriminate it on the basis of color, to embrace those folks, bring them into your community, to bring the Shin Nisei, to bring in anybody who is going to support a Japanese American community or has a Japanese American sensibility or will be an ally or has been an ally in the redress movement, for example. They are your friends. They are the allyship that you need to survive. And the message is very clear to me, is that you need allies, you need support, you need people to believe in what you believe in. And if you do it in the right way, you can create the kind of political power or leverage to change this country.
As a community, we have experienced what can happen when people choose to remain silent in the face of injustice. During World War II, while Japanese Americans were incarcerated, we realized that there were not many that came to our defense. There was only one national organization who stood up against the executive order placing us in camps, the American Friends Services Committee. Others chose to remain silent. That silence is consent, and allowed the unjust incarceration to occur. Given our unique history with scapegoating and racial profiling that led to the camps, we cannot remain silent during this time. As a community, we must stand up and speak out in support. With the recent passing of civil rights legend John Lewis, we must remember the words he spoke this year. When you see something that is not right, not fair, not just, you have to speak up. You have to say something. You have to do something. In honor of John Lewis and the many others who have chosen to talk and speak and act out, I encourage all of us to embrace the call for social and racial justice.
I gave myself permission to connect the dots. I give my permission to use my voice. I give my permission to be a little louder. I give my permission to show up for others. Now, connect the dots. Please learn from history. This should never happen again. But we have a lot of work to do. So I'm counting on the Yonsei and Gosei, and I'm asking you to do it in memory of the Sansei, Nisei, and Issei, and all the COVID fatalities. Thank you for listening.